CHI, as you know, is the only statewide organization in California with a mission to research, develop, and advocate policies and actions that promote biomedical science, biotechnology, pharmaceutical and medical device innovation, and the life sciences industry in general. Representing more than 275 leading biotechnology, medical device, diagnostics, and pharmaceutical companies, both public and private, academic research organizations, and legal, accounting, consulting, and financial service organizations. CHI strives to advance responsible public policies that foster medical innovation and promote scientific discovery. Today, CHI has assembled more than 200 executives from these companies who will join us during the course of this day, as well as leaders from the state's academic research community together with policymakers to discuss critical issues and opportunities facing our community. The goal of today's forum is to produce a clearer understanding of the needs of the biomedical community and how we can sustain California's as well as our nation's leadership in this critical area. Medical innovation has been at the cornerstone of the economic engine for this country, and we want to see that continue. In light of increased global competition and increased pressure for funding for biomedical research. This forum could not come at a better time. The Supercommittee in Washington, D.C. is tasked with the burden of recommending $1.2 trillion in deficit reduction, with the NIH and biomedical innovation as likely targets for reduced funding. In this turbulent environment, the need to identify new paradigms for how we partner, collaborate, and innovate, and how we maintain our leadership has never been more critical. Now, on to the first panel of the morning. This panel is focused on the field of oncology as a case study in innovation and access, addressing some of the critical issues we've just outlined. There's been a lot of debate here in California and in Washington, D.C. about the promise of personalized medicine and new targeted therapies, with some expressing frustration that the advances have not arrived fast enough. Oncology may be the exception to this. The success of the industry overall, both in terms of job creation and critical improvements in human health, can be tied back to the investment in scientific and medical research funded by the NIH, private investors, and venture firms. Currently, more than 80% of the NIH's funding is awarded through nearly 50,000 grants to approximately 325,000 researchers at over 3,000 universities, medical schools, and biomedical companies, many of which are located here in the Bay Area. But it's getting tougher. The funding climate for federal support for biomedical innovation, life sciences work, and the discovery and development of new therapies is becoming more scarce. What we're going to ask our panelists to address today is whether oncology might be a model for spurring innovation and whether the recent advances in cancer therapy serve as an example of academic, public, and private partnership success. Government and privately funded research has revolutionized how we think about cancer. 1 or even 2 decades ago, cancer treatments were mostly reactive, toxic chemotherapies that were based on organs involved, and the treatment depended on literally brute force therapies that were highly toxic and often greatly diminished the quality of a person's life. Today, basic research in cancer biology is moving treatment towards more effective, targeted, smart drugs, if you will, that are less toxic and that are tailored to the genetic profile of each patient and each patient's cancer. This morning, we're fortunate to have panelists with a diverse set of skills and experiences and perspectives, and I think they'll be able to answer most of the questions on the topic that we'll cover. What barriers continue to exist in the field? What needs to be done to improve patients' access to therapies? And how can we continue to innovate in a time with potentially fewer financial resources? We want to make this an interactive session, and with us today to start our comments, and I'll introduce each of the panel members. First, immediately to my left is Dr. Robert Figlin, Associate Director of the Academic Development Program and Director of the Division of Hematology and Oncology at Cedars Sinai Samuel Oskin Comprehensive Cancer Institute. He's a board-certified physician in both medical oncology and internal medicine, and a prolific researcher known for advancing urologic and lung cancer therapies. Dr. Figlin's expertise has resulted in the development of novel anti-cancer drugs that have led to improved outcomes for thousands of patients. He's written more than 300 peer-reviewed publications, authored several books on kidney cancer, and published more than 60 book chapters on new approaches to cancer treatment. Also joining us, Ms. Nancy Bradish Myers, President of Catalyst Healthcare Consulting. Ms. Myers is a Washington-based attorney with deep expertise in healthcare law and regulation, policy development, and government. Over the last 2 decades, she's been involved very closely in drug and biotechnology regulatory issues from a range of vantage points. At the FDA, she served in a number of roles, most recently as Special Assistant and Senior Strategic Advisor in the FDA's Office of the Commissioner. Within the private sector, she served as Special Counsel for Science Policy for the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, or PhRMA, Vice Presidential level political healthcare analyst for Lehman Brothers, Reimbursement Counsel and Director of Government Affairs for the Biotechnology Industry Organization, or BIO, Senior Lobbyist for the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association of New Jersey, and she's found time to work on Capitol Hill. Today, Ms. Myers uses her unique 360-degree perspective on our industry to assist organizations in achieving regulatory, reimbursement, and policy goals. Also with us today to provide both an industry and a patient perspective is David Nelson on my far left, CEO of Epic Sciences, who also serves as a board member of the Clarity Foundation. The Clarity Foundation is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization that helps patients acquire and interpret their tumor blueprints without charge. Mr. Nelson is also a biotechnology executive with over 20 years of scientific, operational, and commercial experience. He's been involved in the creation and/or the advancement of a number of startup companies, is the principal investigator of a number of NIH grants, and has served as a grant reviewer for the NCI Director's Challenge Grant. And finally, please welcome Dr. Risa Stack, a partner at Kleiner, Perkins, Caufield, and Byers, the world's leading venture capital firm right here in the heart of Silicon Valley. Since joining the firm in 2003, Dr. Stack has worked to build and support KPCB's personalized medicine portfolio. She's been the founding CEO and a board member of several personalized medicine companies, including CardioDx and Nodality. And in addition to her work directly with portfolio companies, Risa has been involved in developing public policy in molecular diagnostics and personalized medicine, and is also involved in the development of therapeutics companies, including Corthera and Trias. Before joining Kleiner Perkins, Risa was a principal at JP Morgan Partners in the life science practice for 6 years, and in 2004, she was named as one of the 100 most influential women in business by the San Francisco Business Times. Please welcome our panelists. So, as I said, we want this to be a lively, interactive exchange. We will actually start in a conversation that you guys will be invited to participate in, and we'll open the floor for questions throughout. So please write your questions down, keep them in mind, but we'll get the discussion rolling. First question, and this would be just a way, I think, for the audience to get to know the panelists a little bit better. Give the audience, if you will, some perspective on how you come specifically to the topic of biomedical innovation. We've read your bios, everyone knows your experiences, but think a little bit about why this topic is so important to you. So we'll start with Nancy.
Well, I think it's so funny. In DC, we've been talking about innovation for so long, it's hard to go to your root. But I think with me, having worked at the agency, at the FDA, and having worked within industry, you really have to look at how do you actually, and also I've worked with a number of the patient groups, how do you actually meet the needs of the patient? And when you look in, especially in this field of cancer, I'm sure, if you watch the World Series and you watch the baseball game and all the people standing up for cancer, you realize that there is just such a tremendous need. And even though we keep on having cancer treatments approved, there's so many subdivisions of cancer that have to be addressed. So when I come to kind of where innovation is, it comes from the patient perspective, but yet then you look at these companies that have spent years and years trying to develop a new compound, and they have trouble in getting through the regulatory hurdles. And then you get them through the regulatory hurdles, and then they say, oh my gosh, now I have reimbursement challenges. So in DC, we see the gamut of what the challenges on innovation are. And so that's why I find this is such a fascinating topic, because when people are looking around saying, hey, the United States, we need to make more jobs, where are you going to create jobs? You have to go to the innovators to step up and actually move forward and help people have satisfying jobs.
Okay, good. Bob, why don't we come to you next?
Well, thank you, Tony. I think for me, it's relatively simple. I mean, one of the things I've done in my career is I've maintained an office practice in my institution where I see patients, and I don't think there's a single patient that doesn't come to see a cancer doctor that isn't looking to understand why their cancer acts the way it does and should be treated in a very specific way. Now, I've been in this business now for 30 years, so what we had to offer at the beginning of my career is obviously very different now. The innovation, in my view, comes from an absolute understanding that the best innovation comes from an understanding from the bench to the bed to the bench. And it can't just start at the bench, it can't just start in the bed. And there has to be a collaboration of people who understand both the output of the innovation and how to apply it, as well as the science that's in the development. I've been in many situations where extraordinary science seems to have no application, yet there are enormous resources being placed upon that innovation where the application might not quite be ready. The additional thing is in oncology is that when Nixon declared the war on cancer, although it was a wonderful time in our country to understand that we were taking a concerted effort against the disease, it's a bit of a misnomer. Cancer's hundreds of diseases. And had Nixon said, we want to have a war on hundreds of diseases, we might have started decades ago approaching it the way we're approaching it today. Some of the greatest advances in oncology are occurring in subpopulations of patients, genetically identified, agents developed specific for them. And much of what you do day in and day out is understand the changing business model. Because where we used to talk about platform technology, we're now talking about individual technology that's specific for a patient. Best example, recent approval of a drug for lung cancer that only affects 5% of the patients with lung cancer. Lung cancer is the leading killer of men and women in the United States. This drug affects 5%, but you have to examine 100% of the people to find the 5%. So the business model has changed. And the other part of my life has been taking intellectual property that I and others have developed and at a university setting at UCLA, where I was for 25 years, or in my current situation at Cedars Sinai, is to help the intellectual property people at our own institutions understand where the great value is, where there isn't value, how to partner, how to access resources. And having been through a biotechnology company development and then actually selling the company a couple of years ago, I've also been from the very basic discoveries all the way through the business process to the end product, finally having things in the clinic for patients. So for me, it's relatively simple. I go to work every day and I remember that there's a person that's going to see me at some point during that week who's going to want something different today than what his aunt, uncle, sister, brother had weeks, months, or years before.
Okay. Risa, why don't we start with you?
Sure.
Next.
So I'd like to pick up on the comment that a lot of what we do as a venture capitalist is we translate science into businesses. And there's a lot of fantastic science out there, as you just mentioned, and but they're not necessarily businesses. So that's a lot of what our focus is. I would say that, and the other component is there's cancers, hundreds of diseases, which is something we really believe in. And we have focused a lot of our efforts on personalized medicine to try and figure out what those different diseases are. And I would say we don't think about them, we do think about them in the context of breast cancer, lung cancer, et cetera, but we're much more focused on the molecular basis of disease. So we have developed a large practice in molecular diagnostic companies, which is really aiming to identify the molecular basis of disease. And that's been a big focus for us. So we can treat patients who will benefit from a particular therapy instead of developing a therapy that's one size fits all and only 30% of the patients benefit. That's been a big focus of what we've been doing. And the personalized medicine front, we are very interested in both the gene expression and the genetics, but I think more recently we're very interested in pathways, because we believe that there's going to be a few diseases where there's one single particular gene that drives that disease, but often cancer is a disease of pathways, and multiple pathways interact, and you need to understand how they're all interacting, because you may go back and treat a patient with a different therapy based on how the cancer has changed and accommodated the therapy that you've given them. They've become resistant, and then now you have to understand how that cancer has responded and deliver the appropriate molecular treatment. I'd like to make a broader comment just about the environment, and I would say that we are more focused in developing companies in both the diagnostics and therapeutics in cancer right now, and some of that's because of both the regulatory and the reimbursement environment. From a regulatory perspective, the FDA has become a lot more conservative, and so there's a big focus on safety. So from a venture capitalist perspective, it's difficult to focus on some of the chronic diseases like diabetes or obesity because the bar for safety is so high. And whereas diseases like cancer, yes, safety is an issue, but these people are dying, so there's a little bit more leeway given to us, so there's a lot more focus on innovation in cancer right now because of the regulatory environment. I would say the same with regards to reimbursement, again, because the reimbursement is becoming something that we think about when we first see a company instead of when we've already funded the company. And again, if you have targeted therapies and that you can identify the subset of patients that benefit, as Robert next to me said, then there's a strong belief that the companies will get paid for developing those therapies. So interestingly, I think the current environment, development of new cancer therapeutics and diagnostics is actually, there's more focus on that because of both the current regulatory and reimbursement environment. So.
Okay, and then David, last word on this one.
So for better or for worse, I probably reflect the history of biotechnology in the last sort of 25 years. So I started off in the late 80s doing my graduate work in this hot new area called genomics. And in the early 90s, from 93 to 97, I postdoced in Francis Collins Institute at the NHGRI, and that was clearly going to become the future of science and the future of medicine, that we'd understand the genome and that would transform the world and all was going to be well. And so as we progressed through the genome project and we realized that we'd sequenced all the genes, then the problem was not actually having sequences or genes. It was having compounds to treat those. And so then combinatorial chemistry came along, and I worked for a company then called Aurora Biosciences, which was a company involved in developing high-throughput screening technology to screen all the compounds against all the new targets that came out. So this was back from 97 to 2000, the genomics, the omics world, and this was going to revolutionize sort of the world. And of course, everybody expected by the early 2000s we would have thousands of new chemical entities that were very targeted and focused, and of course none of that happened. And then people realized, well, it wasn't these combinatorial chemistry libraries where the real value lied. It really, because that was now becoming a commodity. Hits were a commodity. So what we really needed was very good medicinal chemistry. So I worked with a company that was based on mostly medicinal chemistry, focused on Casey Nicolau out of the Scripps Research Institute, with the idea that we really needed better molecules. So worked on that for a while, and then realized that now, in fact, having I&D type compounds were also becoming commoditized. And the real value in the industry did not lie in the platform technologies, which they did in the late 90s. It lay in the actual compounds themselves. So since 2000, I've been working really on the therapeutic side, and mostly in oncology, starting therapeutic companies or working with startup therapeutic companies in oncology. And as I progressed, I realized that there's still this tremendous gap. So I've sort of downstream integrated myself from genomics down to screening, down to therapeutics. Now we're in the clinic in the 2000s, and I realized, well, the real name of the game is getting through regulatory approval, but it's actually reimbursement. And it finally dawned on me after about 20 years in the industry who our customer really is. It's to some degree the patient, but in many respects it's the payer. And one of the funny things that I've discovered over the last 7 years or so of attending all of these meetings is that there's a huge amount of meeting representation on personalized medicine. And most of that is really driven by the science. And there's a fair amount of angst and a lot of press given to the problems with the FDA. But the one group that's almost universally underrepresented is the actual customer, and that's the payer. And I think one of the things that really has driven me now towards personalized medicine in oncology, and I think why this is so timely and so fascinating, is that for the first time, there really is, I think, a revolution in our industry. We really are at the point where we're going to shift from this old era, as Tony said, from impersonalized medicine to personalized medicine. And we see that now with the BRAF inhibitor for melanoma. We see it with the ALK inhibitor coming out of Pfizer. We see it with the drug for cystic fibrosis that's just coming out as well. They're good drugs, but they're only good for small subsets of people. And when I think about oncology, I think one of the challenges has always been we have all these drugs, but they don't work very well in many people. They work very well in small sets of people. So how do we make that dream a reality? And I think one of the advantages we have with personalized medicine and oncology is all the stakeholders for the first time are aligned. So we have the payers, the physicians, the patients, the providers. They're all aligned around doing the right thing. And the big laggard has always been the pharmaceutical companies who've said, I don't want to give up any of my market share. But when you start looking at what's just transpired with the ALK program, you have a situation where you have a first in man in 2007 to an approval in 2011. And that was done with about a 350 patient pivotal trial. And all of the pharmaceutical companies are standing up and taking notice. And where I sit, my day job is at a company called Epic Sciences, which is a circulating tumor cell company focused on developing companion diagnostics with pharmaceutical partners. And one of the interesting things for me is I've been doing business development in oncology for 10 years, and I've never seen the level of desperation in pharmaceutical companies as I do right now when they're coming to me at a clinical stage program saying, look, we realize the only way to get this compound to the finish line is with a companion diagnostic. The FDA won't approve it without one, and I'm certainly not going to get reimbursed unless there's one there. And I think this was driven home very nicely by a report that came out, a white paper by Medco. Probably not highly touted, but it certainly should have been. This came out in May of this year. And Glenn Stetton, who's the CMO of Medco, said, there's an interesting observation. More than 90% of the recently improved oncology drugs cost $20,000 or more for 12 weeks of treatment. And he basically said, most of the drugs that we see in the pipeline are going to be that expensive or more. That is unsustainable unless you tailor that drug to the specific patient. And so I think what he said is an echoing from the reimbursement side, which is, look, these drugs are incredibly expensive. The only way it's sustainable, and to Tony's point, the super committee is meeting right now to shave off $1 trillion in the budget, and healthcare is a prime target. The only way we're going to get there is if we deliver personalized medicine that makes much more sense for everybody.
So let's, you've heard some consistent themes here. We've talked about personalized medicine, we've talked about subpopulations, we've talked about biomarkers, we've talked about the very important issues of reimbursement and the payer. Let's try to put all this in context. So if there were ever a good example of an opportunity for personalized medicine. Oncology's it, right? There are lots of other great examples. Yet, there are still difficulties we have in advancing oncology therapies, not just from the company to the market, but at the very beginnings on the science side of things. So let's talk a little bit about what's standing in the way. Here you've got this wonderful mix of biology and molecular biology and an opportunity to target. What's standing in the way? Let's talk a little bit about the environment. Risa?
The overall environment, I guess, I would say, interestingly enough, what's staying in the way to some extent is the payers. Mm-hmm. So to your comment on payers, it's really interesting. We actually have a partner who used to work for payers as a consultant to payers. We've had him for 2 years because whether or not you can get paid is such a big deal, particularly in the diagnostics perspective. And that gets to my comment of what's staying in the way is a lot of our companies, for the molecular diagnostics in oncology, and we have several companies in this area, you can develop a very good molecular diagnostic. It's different than drug development because you can pretty much develop a good diagnostic. It's going to be, what is your clinical question and the sensitivity and the specificity of the diagnostic. But we believe if you do good science, you can get there. But the big challenge, one of the big challenges is getting the payers to reimburse for them, because to develop these specific diagnostics that we do, like at Genomic Health, we charge $3,000 for a diagnostic that aids on a $30,000 decision. But one of the challenges is it's like the first reaction of the payers is like, it's $3,000. They don't think about the $30,000 decision they may be avoiding. So I think what we focus a lot on is trying to get, and we actually, we have relationships with all the major payers. They come visit us. We have one in quarterly because we're trying to understand how they think, but with the goal of getting them to not look at the $3,000 diagnostics, but the $30,000 therapy they're saving. And so I think from our perspective, one of the challenges is kind of that change in mindset. Think that you've got to spend some money on the front end to save money on the back end. And by the way, it's better for the patient, because if they're not going to benefit from that therapy, let's not give it to them. And if you do give them a therapy they don't benefit, odds are that you are having a very negative effect on their health, and it may be more challenging when you do find the therapy.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the focal point that we're challenged with. We know when we started oncology 30 years ago, it was treat everybody and try and find the few that would benefit. We are now in a paradigm shift that is treat the few that will benefit so you don't have to treat the many that won't. Mm-hmm. That is a decades-long transition. The thing that has not yet occurred is we've not educated our future cancer patients about that. We've not educated our future payers about that. Using the ALK example that was brought up, the test that Abbott produces costs a certain amount of money. You have to test 100% of the people to find the 5. But you save the 95% of the people from having to receive the drug because it will not work. So that's one piece. The second piece, and I think that your institute is so critically important, and hopefully we'll talk about this, is the overwhelming minority of cancer patients do not participate in any clinical investigation. Participate in clinical investigation. Average, somewhere around 3 to 5% of our population. 95% of cancer patients who receive their care in this state and in this country do not participate in the questions that we're trying to ask and answer. One of the things that I think we need to be doing is engaging our cancer patients and advocacy groups to ask and answer the questions that companies, the institute, the payers would like answered. Oftentimes, what's occurring in the pits, as I call it, when we're seeing people, is we're being asked to make decisions about treating patients that have been approved, drugs that have been approved by the FDA, where the overwhelming majority of patients have been treated outside the United States, ex-US. There are some studies that are before the FDA now where 95% of the accrual actually takes place outside the United States, let alone outside of California. We as a society I think, and I'm coming at this from the point of view of an investigator, have to have a bigger voice with our patients participating, have to try and place the trials here in a way that allows them to be efficient and productive, because obviously Tony's company, anybody's company, wants time is money as one speaks, but recognizing that as Japan, China, and others have done, we're a very heterogeneous group. The United States, a country of immigrants, and our pharmacodynamics and our pharmacokinetics will be different than oftentimes what drugs are approved for in ex-US clinical trials. So personalized medicine also has to be a commitment by individuals all represented across the panel and the payer to ask and answer questions that are important for our own patients.
So let's pick this up, because this is very interesting. We're in a way setting up a kind of a rational world, which we all live in. It's all very clear to us, right, what needs to be done. But then there's Washington, and it's so easy to blame Washington for everything. Nancy, tell us a little bit about, does Washington have a tin ear to this, or are there people who really are just struggling with this but want to do the right thing?
Well, I think people want to do the right thing. I mean, when you boil it down, people really want patients to get the treatments that they need. But I think Washington's in a little, Washington's such as, but I think, first of all,
it's a big term.
Yeah,
so no,
I'm here to help.
And you've got the podium, so you divide it up any way you like.
But I think if you look at just taking it up to the super committee level, they've got to cut, this super committee, which is 12 members of Congress, are supposed to cut $1.2 trillion out of the deficit for the next 10 years. Okay, if they fail, and they're supposed to do this, by November 23rd. If they fail, there's an automatic kick-in where that $1.2 trillion will be cut. It will start being cut by 2013. Half of it will be spent, will go to defense, will be a defense cut, but half of it will be a domestic policy cut. So then you look at what is one of the big domestic policy programs that you guys as innovators in cancer care about? Medicare. Well, if you have to cut Medicare by 2%, drugs is part of that, and the innovation. Who uses a lot of cancer medicines? A lot of people who are on Medicare or Medicaid. So you've got that challenge. So what the policymakers have tried to do is say, okay, let's go into this value-based healthcare. It gets into your personalized medicine concept, and how do payers make sure they're paying for the right things for the right people? Well, as innovators, a couple years back when I used to be Bio's reimbursement counsel, I worked with Covance to write a book on how to make sure you'll get paid. It's looking at the clinic. This is how you have to design you have to have an injectable because Medicare Part B will pay for it. And so we had a rip and tear on how to make sure you got paid. Well, now in your clinical trials, you need to start proving your value. It's not just, you have to show when you finally get there with your diagnostic test and your personalized medicine that you're going to bring value to it. And I think that's one of the challenges for industry when you look at hurdles and what are our future policy challenges. Well, one of the ways is you're going to look at all this data that has, you've got FDA starting a Sentinel program, which looks at post-marketing data. And it pulls in information from all these payers, CMS things, and it tries to look for safety signals. Well, FDA wants to look at it for safety, but they know payers will go into this database at some point and start looking at, your comparative effectiveness research. You'll use it in a lot of different ways, and that will be someone else will come through and figure out value. So when you look at, the challenges, Washington wants to do the right thing. It's very hard. We don't like to do the right thing, but we try. But you've got, not only do you have Congress who now has to cut, you also have FDA who, which is a whole nother topic, where on personalized medicine, FDA has been actually pretty good at being pretty flexible in the requirements if you're working on a rare disease. That's fantastic, and as you say, cancer's lots of different groups. So in the orphan diseases, they've been very flexible. Where FDA gets more conservative is when an innovation changes the healthcare paradigm. If you really go in and say, okay, this is how we're going to change how breast cancer is treated, and it's going to affect lots and lots of people, that's where the agency gets a little nervous. They say, well, we need more data to make sure all those people aren't hurt. And you've got payers saying, hey, we got to watch this pretty carefully too.
So let's hang out there for a second, because David, you started this conversation with the discussion about payers. And in a moment, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about, are we moving to more of a European value-based reimbursement and approval system? Because I think that's one of the questions. But before we get there, Nancy, let's just hang out here for a moment. So it's clear what needs to be done. It's clear that there are great system savings opportunities that Risa and Bob have talked about, right? If you target the right therapies for the right people. Is the logic of that falling into place from a policy point of view? Can you put all the pieces together and say, if I spend a little money here, I can save a lot of money there? Is that the perspective on the policy side, or are we not there yet?
Well, I definitely can say from the industry side, most of my industry clients aren't even bringing forward products without a companion diagnostic. I mean, that seems to be where people are going. On the reimbursement side, it is going to be challenging, and I don't do as much reimbursement as I used to. But it's, if you've got a diagnostic test that costs $3,000, and 100% of the people have to be, use it, you have to use that $3,000 screening in order to find the 5%. There is an economics there for payers that's really hard. I mean, yes, you're saving 30, but they've got to crunch all the numbers and see if that's...
But why is it hard? I mean, help the audience understand why it's hard.
Well, because there's a finite amount of money. Patients want the best of the best. I think that you've got a Medicare population that's exploding. The federal government is on the hook. And when you see what the federal government does on the policy side, payers follow, or sometimes the payers drive it. But those two things move hand in hand. So if, as the government feels squeezed for payments and they don't, they want to make sure they're only paying for the right thing for the right person, and they can't get into the practice of medicine, so goes the other payers. So I think that's the...
Okay.
So I can comment from real world experience in the sense of what our companies are being asked for now is they want clinical utility and health economic data. That's what they want for...
They meaning payers?
The payers.
Or they meaning the government?
The payers. So, and the government. So in the government is a payer, and here in California we all go through Palmetto. And I think as Nancy said, a lot of cases, particularly in diagnostics where I work, that if Palmetto makes a coverage decision, then it's often the private payers then will move forward, at least in the diagnostics area. But all of our companies being asked for health economic data and clinical utility data. And sometimes we have it, and the payer says, well, it's not in our population. So what we end up doing is negotiating with them to do a work in, we're going to do this many patients, of your patients, and then after that we'll look at the data, and then you can figure out, should you pay for this? But they all have their own formula and their own hurdle. So it's not like, okay, I do this particular study with payer A, and then I can apply it to everyone. You have to go to each individual payer, and because they all want to figure out whether or not they should pay for it. And so I think that's going to be one of the challenges going forward as we focus on the value of the diagnostic or the therapeutic. There isn't a standard yet. And so our companies are sitting there going, okay, I got to go to every single one of you and do what each of you want. And that's really challenging for our companies from just a product, can we afford to do that? But just think about the patients. It's one area of the country is going to get some great diagnostic that will gate to a therapeutic, and another one won't because the payer, it's not higher on that.
Well, let's put the private payers aside for just a moment. We'll come back to them. And let's now nuance government. And who government is in their various roles, the big Washington question. So government as a payer, government as a regulator. David, where is this heading? Is there an intersection of the two? I mean, you've got a couple of decades experience under your belt. Talk about where do you see this going?
So I see lots of problems and a few opportunities. So the problems are the fact that if you look at the whole, we're talking about personalized medicine, and most of what we talk about, we spend 90% of our time talking about the personalized therapeutic. But remember that these are companion products. So 50% of the value really lies with the diagnostic, but as Risa has talked about, the diagnostics are not compensated economically for the value that they bring to the table. So just to put some metrics around that, if you look at Herceptin, that's $1 billion drug. If you look at the entire market for the HER2 test on which that $1 billion drug is based, the entire market is maybe $100 million. And that's divided among 5 players, which brings us to another problem, which is intellectual property. In the case of the therapeutic world, you have economic value and protection tied up in the composition of matter of your compound. If you go to the diagnostic space, it's very hard to capture intellectual property. The markers that we're all looking at are pretty well known. And so there's actually at least 5 players that offer FDA-approved HER2 tests. And so you're dividing that $100 million market among 5 players. And remember, each of those, remember that key word that I said, FDA approved. So they actually had to go to fairly extraordinary lengths from a cost perspective to get to that level of approval. So there is a fundamental challenge in that the diagnostics are not compensated for the value that they bring to the therapeutic companion product. And to sort of add another example of that, people have talked a lot about ALK as this great, huge success story. And there's all kinds of press about Pfizer and how great this is. How much press have you seen about Abbott? I'd say virtually none. And the reason is, why is that? Well, economically, this isn't a great boon for Abbott. So Abbott is getting $250 a test for a $100,000 a year drug, and it's taken possibly one time for that patient. So I think it actually reflects the fact that Abbott did a poor job of trying to represent the value that they bring to the table. And I think a great example, and Risa's sort of experience as well, genomic health is really the poster child for the paradigm that we all need to follow, which is they spent a huge amount of effort and a great amount of time and cost to develop the model which showed the value that they bring to the table. And they actually could justify the $3,000 test because they could point to very specific economic models which suggested that the value is there to the payers. And so God forbid, but I think one of the challenges that we have and one of the limitations we have in our industry is that we don't have enough economic modelers to justify the value proposition to make the diagnostics where they need to be in terms of the therapeutics and to represent that case to the payers. And so I think what we really need to do is focus our attention on that activity.
Well, Bob, you're an investigator. You're a Renaissance man of sorts because you've done a lot of things. Is this frustrating to you? I mean, as a person of one of the keepers of intellectual resource, as a scientist, how does this look to you?
Well, I'm not frustrated. As I say to my trainees, this is the most exciting time to be in cancer in the last 40 years. So this is not a time for frustration. There are great opportunities. Everything that's being described, although challenged, will offer our people with cancer at risk or who have the disease an opportunity that our parents and our past generations never had. So the opportunity is there. I think one of the nice things about today's conversation is it's starting to identify where the challenges are. Let me tell you how the patient views it, which could be helpful for how we develop things in this country. And also recognize that unlike decades ago, where there, pardon my English, a lot of low-hanging fruit in cancer, there's not as much low-hanging fruit. You now have to jump further than you've ever had to jump in a therapeutic because there have been therapeutics that have existed before. In my own area in kidney cancer, one of the areas that I have expertise in, we've approved 6 drugs in the last 5 years. We will approve 2 new drugs in the next 18 months. We will have 8 drugs in this space in the span of 6 years. When I talk to my European colleagues, they laugh at us. They say, you approve everything, but you tell no one what's the priority of how to use it. You give them the evidence, you call it level 1, but you don't differentiate. Whereas in Europe, they go along and they say, we're just going to say no to some of the same things that in the United States you say yes to. And we could argue about what's right or wrong about how that's done, but I will tell you that, to your question about are we moving more toward a European model, I don't know where we're moving, but we don't have a sustainable model here. I'm not saying that that's the right model that we need to go to, but I think we need to understand evidence not just from the point of view of a diagnostic or a therapeutic, but its value, its comparative effectiveness, and its economic impact. And if I was a payer, and I was then talking to a patient, and I could make the argument that the expenditure of resources by you and your payer is justified because of A, B, C, D, and E, as opposed to I have something to give you, the conversation expands. People make informed choices. Cancer patients are incredibly bright. Their families are incredibly bright. They read the literature. The web is there for them. And what we have to do is help them make those value decisions. They're not so easy, and I'm not yet sure that the paradigm shift has occurred in industry, academia, and the payer to allow that paradigm shift to get down to the person that we're delivering it to.
Okay, so this is terrific. Who helps them make that value judgment? Is it the role of government? Is it the role of the companies? Is it the role of the caregiver?
Well, I think that at the end of the day, healthcare is a partnership of many groups. It used to be decades ago, you go to your doctor, and your doctor would say to do X. And you'd say, thank you, doctor, I'll do X. That's not where we are anymore. And our physicians are constantly on the phone with the payers. The payers are constantly on the phone with the government. The patients with cancer are wondering why they have to be delayed for their treatments based upon things that are out of their control. So I guess the answer is that even if the physician in front of the patient is the point of contact, it's the point of contact that must be melded by all the things behind it, which is industry, government, and the delivery of care.
So that's different than when I went to medical school, which was, I don't know, 500 years ago, or some long time ago, where we didn't learn how to do that. We learned what was in the diagnostic manual, what was in the anatomy book, and we didn't learn the sophisticated interrelationship of all of these forces in making a good value judgment. The last question is, what's the single most important question we'll have to answer in the next 5 years? We're just going to go down the line, 30 seconds, no more. David.
So value, that's the one thing in the next 5 years that we need to, I think, really focus on and bring to the table. And just interestingly, so the nonprofit I work with is the Clarity Foundation, and it was founded by Dr. Laura Shalver, who's a biotech cancer specialist who had ovarian cancer. She went to her doctor and they said, we're going to pull out one of our chemotherapies. And she's like, that's so stupid. It's 2006. We know what the molecular characterizations are, so she actually screened her own tumor, identified drugs that would be most helpful to her, and is now a 5-year survivor, and has now instituted that for ovarian cancer patients around the country.
All right, so value.
Value.
Okay, Nancy.
So that was, I was thinking that Jerry Maguire, show me the money, but I think it's really show me the value. I mean, I think that's going to be the name of the game. And I think really for innovators, really trying to harness all these new data points that are out there where you've got FDA generating, safety data, you've got people looking at comparative effectiveness. I think companies are going to have to really look at who's making those comparative effectiveness decisions, and what are the standards that we will accept on those? Because any researcher can go in and pull, you can make the data sing in a lot of different ways. Mm-hmm. And I think for innovators, some of the things that you guys are doing is really good, and that's fantastic for your clients, and because companies are really going to have to understand how are different people going to use that data for me or against me, okay, and how do I prepare for that?
Okay, so Jerry Maguire and show me the money. Risa.
So I need to know the pathway to value and what the standards are so I can help my companies. Right now, everyone's defining value differently in terms of health economic value, clinical utility. Show me what it is, so when I help a company develop a product, they know what they have to hit and they know what the process is that they will get reimbursed or approved. Because right now, what the biggest problem is, you keep moving the goalposts, and it's really hard when the goalposts are constantly moving, and I'm much more worried about the goalposts in the game of reimbursement right now than I am in regulation.
Okay, just tell me what it is. Good.
Yep.
Bob?
Education. I think that we need to educate current and future cancer patients in this conversation so that they can be advocates for their own care, because it's not a size fits all, and we don't do a good job of letting people know about this conversation and the complexities. So when words come up like death panel, those words would mean nothing if our future patients and our friends and family were educated about the complexities of how we deliver care in this country.
So this has been a conversation about value, science, collaboration, and thank you for the question, the human touch. So you guys have been really terrific, and I've enjoyed doing this with you, and thank you very much.